In the quiet corners of the Ottoman Empire, hidden behind thick stone walls and iron gates, life followed a rhythm most outsiders could never imagine. Christian nuns, devoted to prayer and study, lived in communities that were protected, yet constrained, respected, yet closely watched. But what no one expected was how these women, cloistered and often overlooked, shaped the world around them in ways history rarely records. Their stories are tucked between the lines of official documents, whispered in chronicles, and embedded in the faint traces of convent life. Little is known about them today, yet their lives were filled with challenges, courage, and ingenuity. Consider a convent in the heart of Constantinople in the early 16th century. The streets outside were crowded with merchants, soldiers, and travelers. But inside, a different rhythm prevailed. Bells marked hours of prayer, silence was a currency, and knowledge was carefully preserved. But even in this seemingly secure environment, unexpected challenges arose. What happened when the political wind shifted, when governors changed, when laws that were meant to protect also imposed strict limitations? The nuns had to navigate a world of tension and uncertainty, balancing devotion with survival. How did they maintain their faith, their routines, and their communities under such conditions? And more importantly, how did they leave a mark on the world despite being cloistered? Across the empire, similar stories unfolded. In the mountainous regions of Thessaly, convents perched on cliffs and hidden valleys served as sanctuaries, not just for prayer, but for cultural preservation. Manuscripts were copied, religious traditions maintained, and local networks quietly flourished. Yet these communities faced not only the harshness of the natural world, but also the subtleties of Ottoman law. Convents were protected under the millet system, which allowed certain religious freedoms. But that protection came with strings attached. The leaders of these orders had to negotiate with local officials, sometimes offering gifts, sometimes invoking centuries-old agreements. Their resilience was quiet but persistent, a subtle form of resistance. Could it be that these women, through simple acts of care, scholarship, and diplomacy, were quietly shaping the empire's cultural tapestry in ways historians barely notice? There are moments that hint at extraordinary ingenuity. Imagine a nun who notices the deterioration of her community's sacred texts. There are no formal schools for female scribes, no public recognition for her work. Yet she devises ways to preserve ancient manuscripts using materials at hand, sometimes enlisting local artisans in secret. Or consider the ways convents provided education to girls from surrounding villages, subtly challenging social norms while staying within the law. These acts, seemingly small, created ripples across generations. What motivates such courage? Is it faith, necessity, or a quiet rebellion against invisibility? And then there are the stories that defy expectation entirely. In some coastal cities, nuns served as intermediaries between different communities, exchanging news, goods, and even ideas. They maintained networks that connected Constantinople to Athens, Smyrna to Crete, always within the confines of their cloisters, yet expanding the reach of their influence. It's remarkable to think that women, whose daily lives were constrained by vows and social norms, could have such far-reaching impact. How do we reconcile the quietness of their existence with the subtlety of their power? Throughout the empire, the tension between restriction and creativity defined the experience of these communities. Laws limited where they could travel, who they could interact with, and how they could express themselves publicly. Yet, within the walls of their convents, they discovered freedom, freedom to think, to learn, to preserve, and to innovate. Little is known about their individual lives, but what emerges from archives, letters, and rare manuscripts is a portrait of resilience. One can't help but wonder, if we looked closer at other overlooked communities, how many more hidden stories of courage might we find? By opening this story, we enter a world where power and devotion, law and freedom, invisibility and influence intertwine. The nuns of the Ottoman Empire were not just passive observers of history. They were actors, sometimes subtle, sometimes bold, who navigated one of the most complex empires the world has ever known. Their lives challenge our assumptions about agency, faith, and the meaning of influence. As we continue, we will explore not just their routines and rituals, but the extraordinary ways in which they adapted, survived, and left legacies that echo even today. What lessons can we draw from their quiet courage? How might these stories inspire us to see the hidden threads of history that shape the world in ways we never expected? The Ottoman Empire, at its height, stretched across 3 continents, encompassing diverse peoples, languages, and religions. From the bustling streets of Istanbul to the quiet villages of Anatolia, the empire was a patchwork of cultures, each with its own rhythms and customs. Within this vast mosaic, Christian nun communities carved out spaces for devotion, learning, and social service, navigating a system designed to both protect and control them. Understanding their world requires stepping into a realm of law, tradition, and subtle negotiation. Central to this world was the millet system, an organizational framework that allowed non-Muslim communities, including Orthodox Christians, Armenians, and Jews, to maintain their religious institutions and personal law under the supervision of the Ottoman state. Convents, churches, and schools were officially recognized, and leaders could appeal to the authorities for protection or resolution of disputes. On paper, this was a privilege. Nuns could practice their faith openly, teach, and even manage property. But privileges came with responsibilities and limitations. They were not fully autonomous. Their rights were circumscribed by imperial decrees and local governors' interpretations. How would you preserve your community's identity while constantly negotiating with authorities whose priorities could shift overnight? Legal protections existed, but the consequences of stepping outside them could be severe. Women in religious life were expected to remain within their cloisters, and traveling outside required permission. Land and property holdings were carefully monitored. In some cases, convents were allowed to collect rents from tenants, but any perceived violation of Ottoman property laws could result in confiscation or fines. The tension between legal security and potential vulnerability defined much of convent life. This system demanded constant vigilance, creativity, and diplomacy. How did nuns maintain both compliance and independence in such a structured environment? Social and cultural expectations added another layer of complexity. Convents were spaces of education, not just for nuns, but also for girls from surrounding villages. Literacy, religious instruction, and practical skills were all taught. Yet these opportunities were tightly circumscribed by gender norms and local customs. Nuns became cultural stewards, transmitting traditions, preserving texts, and mentoring young women, all while adhering to rules that limited their public influence. Historical records show that convents sometimes operated clandestine libraries or hidden schools, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Could such quiet acts of preservation have been more revolutionary than any public protest? The empire's legal framework was not uniform across regions. In Constantinople, for instance, convents might enjoy relatively greater protection and access to resources. Meanwhile, in the Balkans or Anatolian highlands, enforcement could be harsher and local authorities more capricious. Governors could levy unexpected taxes, demand favors, or reinterpret laws, forcing convents to negotiate continually for survival. One 17th-century record recounts a nunnery in Thessaloniki petitioning multiple times over decades to secure permission to repair its walls after earthquake damage. These petitions were not simply bureaucratic. They were acts of strategic diplomacy, requiring patience, persuasion, and careful documentation. Religious life itself was highly structured. Nuns followed strict daily routines of prayer, meditation, and work. This structure was not arbitrary, reflected centuries-old monastic traditions, but it also served as a protective shield. By demonstrating obedience, devotion, and social utility, convents maintained legitimacy in the eyes of the state. Some convents specialized in copying manuscripts, producing religious icons, or providing medical care. thereby weaving themselves into the empire's social and economic fabric. Their contributions were both spiritual and practical. How often do we recognize that survival in a complex society requires both compliance and creativity? Notable figures also played pivotal roles in shaping convent life. Patriarchs, local bishops, and prominent abbesses acted as intermediaries between the empire and individual communities. Their influence could determine whether a convent thrived or struggled. In the late 16th century, a convent in Smyrna benefited from a patriarch's intervention, securing tax exemptions that allowed it to expand its library and train more novices. In other cases, abbesses had to navigate disputes with neighboring communities or negotiate with local military commanders. These stories reveal that leadership within the convent was not merely spiritual. It was deeply political, requiring negotiation skills, foresight, and resilience. Beyond law and politics, convents were influenced by cultural and economic realities. Trade routes brought news, goods, and ideas, creating subtle networks of exchange. Manuscripts traveled between monasteries. Merchants carried information about distant cities, and local artisans contributed to convent life. Education was often tailored to regional needs. Girls might learn embroidery and manuscript illumination alongside reading and arithmetic. Nuns served as both guardians of tradition and connectors to the broader world. Could it be that through these networks, convents quietly shaped regional culture, even influencing the empire's perception of Christian communities? Finally, one must consider the interplay between protection and limitation. The same system that allowed convents to exist also imposed constraints that tested resilience and ingenuity. Each decision how to allocate resources, when to petition authorities, which practices to maintain or adapt was a balancing act. These communities lived at the intersection of faith, law, and culture, navigating an environment that demanded both devotion and strategic intelligence. Little wonder that historical records often depict convents as places of quiet determination, where daily choices carried profound consequences. Through this lens, the lives of Christian nuns in the Ottoman Empire become far more than isolated stories of religious devotion. They illustrate how individuals and communities can thrive within complex legal, social, and cultural frameworks. They highlight the subtle forms of influence that can emerge even under constraints, and they invite us to reflect on our own assumptions about power, resilience, and agency. If we look closely, we find that these convents were not passive enclaves, but active participants in the empire's history, shaping culture, education, and even politics in ways that continue to resonate today. In the quiet chambers of a convent, the day began long before the sun touched the minarets of the city. Bells rang softly, calling the sisters to prayer. Silence was broken only by murmured chants, the scraping of quills across parchment, and the rhythmic turning of pages in sacred texts. Every action, from lighting the candles to sweeping the stone floors, was steeped in both devotion and purpose. But beneath this calm routine lay a constant negotiation with the outside world, one that required intelligence, creativity, and courage. Take the story of Sister Eleni in a 16th-century convent near Thessaloniki. Every morning, she oversaw the copying of manuscripts, a task that required meticulous care. Ink had to be prepared from locally available materials. Parchment had to be carefully scraped and smoothed, and errors could mean the loss of an irreplaceable text. Yet one winter, a shipment of parchment from Constantinople was delayed for weeks due to political unrest. Rather than pause her work, Eleni experimented with alternative materials, using thin layers of aged paper treated with natural oils. The result was fragile but usable, and the convent's collection survived intact. Her innovation, quietly recorded in convent archives, shows how adaptability was as important as devotion. Meals followed strict schedules. In larger cities like Istanbul, convents sometimes had gardens or small orchards that provided fresh vegetables, herbs, and fruit. In more remote areas, reliance on local markets made food procurement unpredictable. Sister Miriam, in a coastal convent on the Aegean, had to manage resources carefully when a storm delayed trade ships for weeks. She organized the community to ration supplies, preserving dried foods and teaching novices the importance of careful planning. Beyond survival, meals became moments of teaching and bonding. Recipes, chants, and stories were passed down, blending practicality with spiritual life. Education was central to the convent's mission. Girls from surrounding villages, sometimes as young as 7, came to learn reading, writing, religious instruction, and practical skills like weaving or embroidery. Sister Sophia, known for her strict but compassionate teaching, created a small classroom within the convent's refectory. Here, lessons often intertwined with moral and philosophical reflections. One notable story describes a day when a young girl struggled to read a psalm aloud. Rather than scold her, Sophia recited the text alongside the child, turning frustration into encouragement. This approach fostered both literacy and confidence. And some of her students later became teachers themselves, spreading the convent's influence quietly across the region. But life in a convent was not without risk. Local laws restricted movement, and sudden inspections could occur, sometimes by officials unfamiliar with convent norms. Sister Catherine, a 17th-century abbess in Smyrna, faced such a challenge when a regional governor demanded access to the convent's treasury. Catherine had anticipated such a visit and prepared detailed accounts, demonstrating transparency while protecting sensitive religious items. The encounter ended peacefully, but it highlighted the delicate balance convents maintained between compliance and safeguarding their sacred spaces. Each decision carried both spiritual and practical weight. Health and caregiving were another integral aspect of daily life. Nuns often served as midwives, nurses, or caregivers for the local poor. In a small Anatolian village, Sister Helena managed a tiny infirmary within the convent walls. When an epidemic swept through the region, she organized care, rationed medicines, and ensured the sick were tended to with both skill and compassion. Her diary, preserved in convent archives, describes sleepless nights and the emotional toll of care, but also moments of hope when patients recovered. Through these acts, convents became critical nodes of social support, bridging the gap between spiritual devotion and community service. Rituals, though repetitive, held profound significance. Daily prayers, evening vespers, and feast days created a rhythm that sustained the community. Yet within these rituals, nuns found space for subtle creativity. For instance, Sister Anastasia, an abbess in Crete, developed intricate chants that wove together traditional hymns with regional melodies. These unique adaptations not only enriched spiritual life, but also strengthened communal identity. Music, stories, and shared rituals reinforced bonds, creating a sense of stability even when external circumstances were unpredictable. The convents also nurtured hidden forms of scholarship. Sister Teresia in Constantinople was known for her expertise in herbal medicine, which she recorded in detailed manuscripts. She exchanged knowledge with local physicians, always carefully navigating the boundaries set by the empire. These writings, blending practical and spiritual wisdom, survived in small collections long after her death. Stories like hers illustrate that convents were not merely passive observers of knowledge. They actively contributed to its preservation and dissemination. One of the most compelling aspects of daily life was the way nuns handled unexpected crises. Consider a convent in the Balkans that faced a severe flood, threatening both buildings and manuscripts. The sisters worked together, moving precious texts to higher floors, using sandbags made from old cloth, and improvising water barriers. Their ingenuity saved centuries of knowledge. These moments revealed that courage and problem-solving were as vital as piety. They also remind us that history often remembers grand battles and political shifts, but it is equally shaped by quiet acts of resilience. Finally, social interactions within the convent were both intimate and strategic. Decisions about leadership, resource allocation, and external relations required diplomacy and wisdom. Sisters debated, advised one another, and sometimes disagreed passionately. Through these interactions, younger nuns learned negotiation, patience, and ethical reasoning. The convent was a microcosm of society, a place where personal growth, social responsibility, and spiritual discipline intertwined seamlessly. Across centuries and regions, these daily routines and stories reveal the multifaceted lives of Ottoman Christian nuns. They were educators, caretakers, negotiators, preservers of knowledge, and cultural stewards. Through prayer, labor, innovation, and subtle diplomacy, they not only survived, but thrived, leaving legacies that would ripple into the modern world. Reflecting on their lives, one cannot help but ask, how would we navigate constraints while finding space for creativity and impact? How does quiet courage shape history in ways louder events often cannot capture? Historians have long debated the role and influence of Christian nun communities within the Ottoman Empire, and the discussions reveal as much about methodology as about the convents themselves. One perspective emphasizes the protective role of the millet system, viewing convents primarily as institutions safeguarded by imperial law. Scholars supporting this view highlight that the empire recognized religious diversity, allowing convents to operate openly, manage property, and educate young women. They argue that the Ottoman state, far from being uniformly oppressive, offered a framework that enabled Christian communities to survive for centuries. Documents from the 16th and 17th centuries often cite legal protections granted to convents, including exemptions from certain taxes or guarantees of autonomy in religious affairs. In this interpretation, the nuns were beneficiaries of a pragmatic empire that valued stability and social harmony. Yet another perspective paints a more restrictive picture, focusing on the limitations imposed by Ottoman law and local customs. Critics of the protected enclave narrative argue that convents existed in a delicate balance, always negotiating with officials who could reinterpret rules or impose unexpected taxes. Legal records document instances where abbesses petitioned multiple times for permission to repair convents, highlighting how even minor disruptions required bureaucratic skill and strategic diplomacy. Scholars in this camp suggest that, while the millet system provided nominal freedom, it also constrained agency, leaving convents constantly alert and adaptive. From this angle, the nuns' resilience is not just admirable, it is a response to structural vulnerability. A third school of thought emphasizes the cultural and intellectual agency of convents. Here, historians focus on education, manuscript preservation, and social engagement, arguing that nuns were not passive recipients of protection, but active shapers of knowledge and community. Evidence includes preserved manuscripts, records of teaching networks, and correspondence with other religious leaders. For example, convent libraries often contained copies of Greek, Latin, and Ottoman texts, demonstrating both intellectual curiosity and practical ingenuity. Advocates of this perspective highlight that convents contributed to the continuity of Christian learning in the empire, fostering literacy and cultural preservation despite external pressures. In this reading, the convents were small but critical engines of cultural resilience. A related, more nuanced perspective examines regional variation. Constantinople, Smyrna, and Crete offered relatively rich resources, supportive hierarchies, and easier access to trade and information. Convents in these areas could expand educational programs and preserve manuscripts effectively. Conversely, communities in remote Anatolian villages or the mountainous Balkans faced harsher conditions, stricter enforcement, limited resources, and slower access to information. Scholars argue that comparing convents across regions reveals the adaptability and ingenuity of nuns as much as the constraints they faced. Debates also extend to the perception of gender and authority within convents. Some historians emphasize the limitations imposed by a male-dominated religious hierarchy and patriarchal social norms. suggesting that nuns had little influence beyond spiritual guidance and domestic management. Others counter that convents functioned as centers of female leadership, providing structured spaces where women exercised authority, managed finances, and shaped educational programs. The abbess, in particular, wielded both spiritual and administrative power, balancing internal governance with external diplomacy. Finally, scholars consider the long-term implications of these debates. By examining the scholarly debates, we gain not only a deeper understanding of convents, but also a framework for thinking about history itself. The nuns of the Ottoman Empire were at once protected and constrained, silent yet influential, marginalized yet resilient. And when historians debate their significance, we are reminded that history is not just about what happened, but also about how we interpret, understand, and value those who lived it. Their resilience, ingenuity, and moral courage continue to inspire modern communities and institutions, reminding us that small, sustained actions can have profound effects. In Thessaloniki and Crete, scholars today study collections of manuscripts originally compiled and maintained by convents, gaining insights into not only religious practices, but also local language, art, and science. These works reveal the nuns' dual roles as spiritual practitioners and cultural guardians. Without their careful preservation, much of this heritage might have been lost to time. In modern Greece and Turkey, remnants of these educational traditions persist in institutions inspired by convent models, from girls' schools to cultural preservation programs. Perhaps the most profound legacy lies in demonstrated resilience and ingenuity. The convents of the Ottoman Empire survived political upheaval, economic uncertainty, natural disasters, and social restrictions. Their survival depended not on brute power, but on intelligence, creativity, and strategic negotiation. Modern observers can draw lessons from this adaptability. Constraints do not eliminate agency. Challenges can inspire innovation. The careful balance the nuns maintained between compliance and creativity. Tradition and adaptation offers a model for navigating complex social or organizational structures today. How might we apply these lessons in our own lives? Finding ways to influence and preserve what matters, even when circumstances seem restrictive. Cultural influence is also visible in art, music, and ritual. The chants, hymns, iconography, and ceremonial practices nurtured in convents influenced local traditions across regions. Even today, liturgical music in Orthodox communities reflects stylistic developments from convent networks. Artistic preservation, combined with careful documentation of ceremonies and customs, ensured that local religious culture was not only maintained but also enriched. By fostering creativity within constraint, nuns became stewards of intangible heritage, shaping cultural memory in ways that textbooks rarely acknowledge. Finally, the legacy of these communities is evident in moral and social inspiration. Stories of courage, resourcefulness, and quiet leadership offer examples of ethical resilience. Whether negotiating with authorities, educating children, preserving manuscripts, or caring for the sick, these women demonstrated that influence does not always require public recognition. Their lives remind us that ethical action, consistency, and creative problem-solving leave lasting impressions, often far beyond what is immediately visible. In a world that frequently celebrates loud achievements, the legacy of Ottoman convents is a testament to the power of steady, principled dedication. Through education, preservation, service, cultural contributions, and moral courage, Christian nun communities in the Ottoman Empire left enduring marks on the world. Their story is a reminder that history is shaped not only by rulers and battles, but also by those who quietly sustain culture, knowledge, and human connection. By studying their lives, we gain insight into the ways ordinary actions, grounded in devotion and ingenuity, can resonate across centuries. How might we recognize the hidden legacies in our own communities? How can we draw inspiration from those who shaped history without fanfare, yet left a profound impact on generations to come? The story of Christian nun communities in the Ottoman Empire reminds us that history is often shaped in ways we cannot immediately see. Within the quiet walls of convents, women devoted themselves to prayer, education, preservation, and care. Their lives were governed by structure and discipline, yet within that structure, they found room for creativity, adaptation, and influence. They navigated legal restrictions, social expectations, and political uncertainty with intelligence and courage. And while many of their achievements went unnoticed by contemporary chroniclers, the impact of their actions continues to resonate centuries later. From the preservation of manuscripts to the education of girls, from caregiving to the cultivation of culture, these nuns demonstrated that influence need not always be loud or public. They wielded power in subtle, strategic ways, through scholarship, mentorship, and quiet diplomacy. Each act of care, each careful record, each lesson taught in a humble classroom contributed to the survival and enrichment of their communities. Their lives challenge our assumptions about what it means to shape the world. Influence is not always measured by recognition, authority, or fame, but often by persistence, resilience, and ethical action. The convent's experiences also teach us about adaptability in the face of constraints. Legal protections, social norms, and political structures simultaneously shielded and limited them. Nuns had to negotiate, constantly balancing obedience with autonomy, tradition with innovation, and caution with courage. Their strategies offer a timeless lesson. When circumstances restrict our options, ingenuity becomes essential. They remind us that resilience is not passive endurance, 'Tis active engagement with the challenges we face, using creativity, resourcefulness, and foresight to turn limitation into opportunity. Reflecting on these lives invites us to consider the hidden threads of influence in our own world. Just as the convents quietly shaped culture, education, and social welfare, there are countless individuals and communities today whose contributions go unrecognized. Teachers, caregivers, organizers, and innovators often operate without public acclaim. Yet their work forms the foundation for generations to come. By studying the Ottoman nuns, we learn to value not only visible accomplishments, but also the sustained, principled actions that quietly make a difference. The moral courage of these women is equally inspiring. They faced uncertainty, risk, and social constraints, yet remained committed to their values and responsibilities. Their courage was not dramatic or performative. It was practical, patient, and persistent. Each challenge, from protecting manuscripts to negotiating with authorities, required careful thought, emotional strength, and moral clarity. Their example encourages reflection. How might we exercise courage in our own lives, even when the stakes are subtle or invisible? How might ethical action, taken consistently, leave an enduring mark on the world around us? Ultimately, the legacy of Ottoman convents is a testament to the power of dedication, creativity, and resilience. These communities endured because they combined structure with flexibility, discipline with innovation, and devotion with practical intelligence. Their lives remind us that history is shaped not only by rulers and armies, but by those who quietly sustain knowledge, nurture others, and navigate challenges with skill and grace. They teach that influence comes in many forms, and that the most lasting contributions often emerge from patience, ingenuity, and steadfast commitment to values. As we reflect on their stories, we are invited to consider our own potential for impact. What are the hidden ways we might shape the lives of others? How can we cultivate resilience, resourcefulness, and courage in our daily routines? The nuns of the Ottoman Empire demonstrate that even within strict boundaries, individuals can leave a profound imprint that echoes through education, culture, and community long after their daily work seems complete. Their example encourages us to see history not only as a record of events, but as a tapestry of human effort, care, and ingenuity. In closing, the tale of these convent communities is both historical and timeless. It is a story of devotion, creativity, and quiet power. It challenges us to reconsider the meaning of influence and to recognize the enduring effects of moral courage, disciplined effort, and careful preservation. By learning from their experiences, we gain inspiration to navigate our own challenges, honor hidden contributions, and act with intelligence and integrity in the face of constraint. The nuns' lives may have unfolded in centuries past, behind stone walls and iron gates, but their lessons resonate today, reminding us that even quiet, unseen actions can shape the world for generations to come.